religious and philosophical tradition that takes teleology seriously as something real would be open to that. So in that conception, an irreducible intelligence is something that can basically solve problems that, if they had to be solved without intelligence, would be highly improbable. So you might say that intelligence is what they do is they create information that if it had to be accounted for in terms of chance, would be highly improbable.
ID the Future, a podcast about evolution and intelligent design.
I think we can all agree that nothing comes for free in this life. There's a cost, even if we aren't the ones paying the bill. And so it is with the fundamental building block of all life, and that is information. Welcome to ID the Future. I'm your host, Andrew McDiarmid. And today I conclude my 4-part conversation with Dr. William Dembski about his new monograph, Unpacking the Law of the Conservation of Information. Dr. Dembski is a founding and senior fellow with Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture, and a distinguished fellow with the Institute's Walter Bradley Center for Natural and Artificial Intelligence. He's a graduate of the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he earned a bachelor's in psychology and a doctorate in philosophy. He also received a doctorate in mathematics from the University of Chicago in 1988 and a Master of Divinity degree from Princeton Theological Seminary in 1996. He has held National Science Foundation graduate and postdoctoral fellowships. Dr. Dembski has published in the peer-reviewed mathematics, engineering, biology, philosophy, and theology literature. He's the author or editor of more than 25 books, most recently a brand new edition of The Design Inference, co-authored with Winston Ewart, a book you're most certainly going to want on your bookshelf. Well, in this concluding segment, Dr. Dembski discusses the ultimate origin of information, saying there are only 3 possibilities: front-loading, brute chance, and something he calls irreducible intelligence. Dembski explains which of those options seems the most scientifically and philosophically robust. Well, without further ado, let's return to the conversation now. This is part 4, the conclusion of our time together. Now, drawing on Douglas Axe's work, you mentioned that functional protein folds are as rare as 1 in 10 to the 77th. How does this law then turn this rarity into a lack of evolvability that material processes can't overcome?
That number is one that Doug computed, and it was he was looking at a beta-lactamase protein that, as it changed, it conferred antibiotic resistance on particular bacterium. And he argued that on the basis of selective pressures, it was still that improbable to get from some protein or some protein fold that was doing something different to that. So, so you have here a highly improbable event that's happened, and then how do you account for that? I think at this point, maybe it would be good to draw a distinction between conservation of information and the concept that your listeners may be more familiar with, which is this earlier notion of mind-specified complexity. And I think what Doug has identified is specified complexity. So the idea with specified complexity is it's a type of information that is at once improbable but has a pattern that is easily characterized. So it combines what we might call Shannon and Kolmogorov information. But I think the way to see it is as follows. Just bear with me for a moment. Imagine you got a SETI researcher, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and it's listening to a radio, listening for radio signals along some channel, and he gets a sequence of 8 characters, bits. Everything is in bits, let's say. And it's the 8 bits or the byte needed to encode in Unicode the letter A. That could be the indefinite article transmitted by an alien intelligence that knows English. It might be. But it's 8 bits, 1 in 256 probability on a uniform distribution. If you're monitoring millions or billions of radio channels, you will witness that sequence, not just once, but very often. Could you conclude by just receiving that sequence that you're dealing with an intelligence? No. Now, it could be that there was an alien intelligence that was communicating and saying, punching in on a keyboard, a great day has emerged in the history of our civilizations where we finally made contact with the inhabitants of Earth, etc. Okay. But the thing is, that alien intelligence had a cerebral accident right after punching in the letter A. So that letter A is here by intention. It was designed. But because it's so short, lacks complexity in terms of bits, we will not be able to detect that it is the result of intelligence. But if in Unicode you had that entire sentence or paragraph, a great day has arrived in the history of our civilizations, etc., that would be enough complexity, even at the scale of the entire universe, with 10 to the 80 atoms, 10 to the 90 elementary particles, that would still be enough, to reliably nail down that we're dealing with an intelligence. But there's more to it, right? Because, just having a long sequence of random signals, random bits, would also be highly improbable, but wouldn't tell us anything. So what's special about this? Well, it's in English. The vast majority of radio signals would not be in any natural language, to say nothing of being in English, to say nothing of being encoded in Unicode. So there's this specification, this recognizable pattern that can be, in complexity theoretic terms, briefly described. So which would satisfy what the compressibility in a Kolmogorov sense, plus complexity in this probabilistic sense. There's a long sequence of bits. So it's kind of a tension. It's high in probability, okay, and that corresponds to the narrowing of possibilities, but then also on the pattern end, it's recognizable. It's briefly described. Oh, that's an English sentence. Oh, that's Shakespeare or whatever. And so when you get that convergence, that tells you that you're dealing with an intelligence. So that's the gist of my book, my research, Design Inference, and Design Inference 2, which you were so kind to cite, and which I hope your listeners will buy and read if they haven't already. Now, specified complexity, as I develop it there, is a reliable marker of intelligence. And if you've got it, if you witness it, boom, you've got intelligence. And I would say what Doug Axe does is he gives us specified complexity. He shows that these systems, they confer antibiotic resistance, they fold. These are folds, so that itself is a specification. Now, most things are not going to fold in any sort of functional way. So what I would say is, and then he has this improbability of 10 to the minus 77. It's maybe not at the level of the probability of, probabilistic resources of the whole universe, but it's pretty good. It's really good. So I would say, he's got specified complexity, and with that, he can draw design inference that this system, if you're getting this beta lactamase, in the first place, that's going to be exhibit specified complexity and therefore design. So, in a sense, conservation of information won't apply. What conservation of information does is to say, this is also where the Darwinist would come in and say, well, wait a second, Doug, you haven't really looked at all possible evolutionary paths. You're claiming that this is unevolvable. That's really not, that it's super improbable, that it's a case of specified complexity, but it's really not. Because if you really knew what natural selection was doing here, if you knew all the underlying causal pathways, you'd realize that actually it's quite probable. So what always happens in these cases is that the Darwinists see natural selection or some other mechanism as a probability amplifier. Okay. Now we've heard probability of amplifier before in this discussion in the last one, but they do see natural selection as a probability amplifier. And so what seemed to be specified complexity, because specified complexity presupposes that you have a very highly improbable event, right? I mean, remember the SETI example. It had to be improbable, that sequence that was being set. It couldn't just be the letter A. It had to be highly improbable. So once you got that, if you've got that improbability working for you, you've got specified complexity and you've got design. So the way Darwinists try to upset the specified complexity apple cart is by saying, well, you really don't have improbability. You don't really, it just looks like it's specified complexity, but it's really not. Okay. The probabilities are actually bigger. Okay. Because of natural selection. Okay. And so that's where conservation of information kicks in, because it says, okay, we thought that this was highly improbable. It was specified complexity, this event. You're telling us that there's a probability amplifier, in this case, natural selection, that raises the probability. Okay, but but then there's a probability of that probability amplifier. What's the probability of that? How is it that the amplifier worked to amplify the probability in that? I mean, it's this example you gave before. You got an arrow that lands on a target, faraway target, highly improbable to land there. So there's a favorable wind that blows the arrow to the target. So the probability of the arrow landing given the favorable wind now is suddenly very big. Okay. But the probability of that favorable wind is now itself very improbable. And so likewise, getting a selection-rich, capable environment that is able to overcome these improbabilities in precisely that way is itself highly improbable. But I think people kind of see natural selection, naturalistic biologists, they see natural selection as this kind of magic bullet that automatically just explains itself. But natural selection can take lots of different forms in lots of different contexts where, often it can do nothing of interest. There's an experiment of Saul Spiegelman in I think it was the 60s, in which he put, I think some RNAs in a replicase environment. And basically they evolved but they didn't evolve to complexity. They evolved to simplicity. They became much more simple because simplicity had a selective advantage, and often simplicity has a selective advantage. It's just easier to simplify, to have less baggage, So there's nothing magical about selection as such. It can act in an complexity increasing way, as with the Avita program, when complexity was rewarded. It can act in other ways. So selection itself can take many different forms. And for it to act as a probability amplifier for a given case means that it's taken a highly selective form, highly improbable form. And so that's where I would say conservation of information, it acts as the, two punch in the, specified complexity is the number one punch. So it's a 1-2 punch. Yeah. Specified complexity, if you got it, you got design. Oh, you're claiming natural selection as a probability amplifier. Okay, now that probability amplifier is highly improbable. So you got the improbability problem again. You got the specified complexity problem again. Then you want to get rid of that. Okay, now conservation of information kicks in. Now specified complexity, conservation. And it keeps going up and back, but you never escape that sort of dialectic between the two, and you're trapped. You don't get around the design problem, and it's it's a point I've made also for years. Maybe it's just that I haven't made this stuff clearly enough. Maybe I just need to get on Joe Rogan, and just have some really nifty diagrams and ways of putting it that will finally
Yeah.
get across.
Well, I like the 1-2 punch thing. I think Joe would as well.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
we'll see about that.
Yeah.
No.
No, that's good. The 1-2 punch, and that does explain how these two concepts that you've put forward, work together. I like that. Now, another term that you use is irreducible intelligence, and I hadn't heard that term until you used it here, and I really like it. How do you define the term then, and how does the law of conservation of information lead us to a final resting place, so to speak, an irreducible intelligence rather than that infinite regress,
Yeah.
turtles all the way down kind of thing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, just to backtrack a little bit, I mean, this conservation of information, it does imply a regress. So if you've got something highly improbable to explain, you have something that explains it, raises the probability, then that thing is highly improbable. You want to explain that in naturalistic terms, well, then you've got another highly improbable event, another amplifier, another improbability to explain. Now, it seems you can only go back so far. It's if we agree that we're in a finite universe with a finite history, this sort of conservation of information regress has to stop at some point. And it seems that there are only a few possibilities. I mean, broadly, it seems you're either going to have to say that all the information was there from the start. You can say that it is just pure chance, but we're just going to live with it. It's just chance got really lucky, and here we are. All this fine tuning, all this evolution took place. Maybe invoke a multi-universe, so there, I mean, if you're, you can use metaphysics to destroy any scientific theory. I mean, it's, you can make metaphysical assumptions, and all your problems go away. So, but then you raise other problems, right? I mean, so
Yeah.
what's the status of this multi-universe? What's the metaphysical status? Do you really want to saddle yourself with that? But broadly, you've got, all the information was there from the start. Well, how did it start? Is there anything behind that? Does it just become absurd? It's just something we accept. It seems absurd, but it's, do we go with a multiverse, some sort of, just brute chance explanation, or what would be another possibility? Another possibility is what I would call an irreducible intelligence. What would be a reducible intelligence? Well, it's where you keep, explaining the probability amplifier in terms of another probability amplifier, but at some point you come to a final resting place of explanation and say, okay, this is produced by an intelligence that does not have to be accounted for in terms of some sort of improbability. And that then becomes a third possibility. It's not going to be naturalistically acceptable, because, from a materialistic vantage, intelligence is a byproduct of matter organizing itself. Intelligence results from an assemblage of particles, but from certainly a Judeo-Christian vantage, God is not an assemblage of particles. God's mind is not an assemblage of particles. It's not a pattern. And if we're made in the image of God, then, we're also not, our mentality is not patterns, which is actually very good news if you're if you're not a computational reductionist. And I think what I'm describing, I mean, this is from a Judeo-Christian point of view, but I think just about any religious and philosophical tradition that takes teleology seriously as something real would be open to that. So in that conception, an irreducible intelligence is something that can basically solve problems that, if they had to be solved without intelligence, would be highly improbable. So you might say that intelligence is what they do is they create information that's you know, if it had to be accounted for in terms of chance, would be highly improbable. So it's information rich, and so that's what I'm referring to as an irreducible intelligence in this paper. Um, God, ourselves, angels, other beings could fulfill that role. There could also be derived intelligences that, as it were, act as intermediaries between these irreducible intelligences. But since we're looking at the origin of the universe or the origin of this information, where it come from in the first place, ultimately, it seems you are going to have to get to some sort of irreducible intelligence. Derived intelligence would be reducible, to something more fundamental.
Right. And even Richard Dawkins, the eminent biologist and representer of all things Darwin, was prepared to admit, as far back as Expelled, the documentary, that, hey, perhaps, life was seeded, sort of a directed panspermia approach, life was seeded by an alien force. But then again, what about the alien force? And you can go back ad nauseum, but I think it has to stop somewhere. There has to be an ultimate reality at the end of every worldview or philosophical approach to things.
There can be some other possibilities, where we're part of a simulation, and then that simulation itself created, by an irreducible intelligence, and you could have a cyclic universe. But even then, but basically, I don't think you escape this idea of an irreducible intelligence. To your point about Expelled, Dawkins didn't just say that life may have been seeded. He said that life may have been designed by such basically an alien superintelligence. So he allows design there, but then he immediately comes back and says, but even that alien intelligence must ultimately have been explained by some explicable process. And by explicable, he means something purely naturalistic, like, and the only candidate for him is natural selection. So, everything has to funnel through, natural selection at the end of the day, for him. But he basically though allows that life on Earth may have been designed, only it couldn't have been designed by God. It would have been alien intelligence. But even that, I mean, that just becomes arbitrary, doesn't it? I mean, we'll allow an alien, but not, not an intelligence that's unembodied.
Yeah. Well, final question, Bill. Hopefully we're piquing, the curiosity of some folks out there with this new law that you've been working on. What, of all the work that you've put out and the books and the monographs, where do you think is a good place to start for someone who wants to learn more about this and perhaps CSI as well as another pillar of ID?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. The second edition of Design Inference, which is where, it's the place to go if you want to understand specified complexity. We intended actually to include conservation of information in that. But, and the thing is, conservation of information, it's been an idea that's been out there for a long time. Even this law of conservation of information, the way I conceived it before was as a sort of generalization of a number of theorems that were out there. It was only in the fall of 2023 that it kind of the dime dropped for me, where I saw, wait a second, all these theorems are actually just special cases of a very simple probabilistic relationship. And so that's when I wrote this up. But I would say get second edition of the Design Inference to understand specified complexity. Yes, there are some parts that are technical, but there's a lot that's just very accessible. I would say chapters 1 and 2 certainly. I would say sections on specification and probabilistic resources, dip into them. And then there's a chapter 6 on biology. I think that would be of general interest. That's chapter 7. Chapter 6 is probably the most technical. It's about But there's a lot that's just there. I would say don't be intimidated by the technical stuff. Just skip over it because there's always going to be stuff that's of interest. With regard to the paper or monograph on a law of conservation of information, that's a paper that was published 2025 in Biocomplexity. It is a monograph. It's not short. It's I think 52,000 words. So it's book length. But in many ways it functions as a review article. So I've tried to make it very accessible. There is a bit of math in there, but most of it is just motivated by a lot of examples and explanations. So I'm actually working with two co-authors on spinning that off into its own book, and I think most of that text will be preserved, and I think it'll be of general interest. So I wouldn't be intimidated by the fact that it's in this journal Biocomplexity. I would just go. It's free, it's a monograph, and as I said, also it serves as a review article. I have an appendix in there that's about 6,000 words, which just covers the entire the history of conservation of information and law of conservation of information going up to the present. So I think there's just a lot of if you're really interested in this, I would just go in there and and if there are technical things that you're not comfortable with, just skip them. But I think there's a lot that you'll just pick up on.
And I do think that the everyday person can grasp this. I think you're right that it's elementary and there's a simplicity there. So again, the website's thedesigninference.com for getting a hold of the second completely revised new edition of Bill's work, The Design Inference. And then we'll include a link to the monograph as well out of Biocomplexity. Well, Bill, thank you very much for your time. It's very valuable, and appreciate the work you're doing and the chance to unpack this with you today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, Andrew. Thank you. I appreciate this thorough questioning. So it's nice to have to think on my feet and get these ideas out, and hopefully in a more accessible way.
Yeah. And we'll see if we can get Joe Rogan interested in the nature of information, because it's real and it's great. It's really good stuff to wrap your head around, because it does show you that there's a cost, and when you apply it to Darwinian evolution, you start to, understand the evaluation that we've made that says, look, you can't do this. This sort of approach is not going to get you mathematically to where we are. And I think we need to be honest about that. Well, don't forget, listeners and viewers, you can watch these interviews now as well as listen to them on our YouTube channel. Subscribe there and be the first to know about all the videos that are coming out. That's youtube.com/@idthefuture. Well, I'm Andrew McDiarmid. Thank you very much for joining us.
Visit us at idthefuture.com and intelligentdesign.org. This program is copyright Discovery Institute and recorded by its Center for Science and Culture.